Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. All right, so we're going to flip it today. We're going to do the headline second because our guest is also here to talk about a headline and bringing in our very own Sarah Tiano to talk about her recent series on an aunt and trained child welfare caseworker seeking to adopt her own nephews, but who is in jeopardy of losing out to a foster parent. To add a layer of controversy, the two children are biracial, the aunt is black, and the foster parent is white. So we're going to talk it through a little bit with Sarah in a second. Sarah, thanks for joining us. Second time on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Happy to be back.
Last time we had her, she was busy writing a story that would end up leading to California banning out-of-state placements for youth in the juvenile justice and child welfare system. No big deal. No big deal. She's just blushing. She's not going to say anything. Yeah, I'm going to make you give a favorite like you were a regular guest, though. So movie, TV show, musical group, sports team, or book. Give the people a recommendation. What's Tiano's favorite of the day?
So mine is not going to rock anyone's world, but I am repping today the one and only Harry Potter, which is a life-changing journey for most millennials, myself included. And I have to, that's the favorite. That's always the favorite. Also, the Los Angeles Clippers. Clippers forever. Go.
I knew that was coming. I knew she couldn't get out of this without talking about that. Which house are you? Slytherin? That's the only one I know. Hufflepuff?
I'll call myself a Ravenclaw.
Ravenclaw. Okay, good stuff. All right, so the series is called Fighting for Kin. Sarah, let's start with the characters involved here and the situation that brought everybody together in this story, which sort of traverses both Oklahoma and Kandiyohi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Kandiyohi County, Minnesota. So who do we have involved as far as an aunt and the children? I know we're not going to name any kids, but set it up for them. What's going on here?
Right. So we heard a few months ago from a woman in Tulsa. She's a child welfare social worker named Ashley Boone, who has been fighting since 2020 to adopt her two nephews, who are now 6 and 7, from foster care in Minnesota. They entered foster care in 2020, and their parents' parental rights were terminated the following year. But because all of the relative caregivers who kind of stepped forward were from out of state, the children instead went to a series of local foster parents while caseworkers, attempted to give the birth parents a chance to reunify. The case has gotten dragged on for a number of reasons, and it's ultimately wound up in court this past summer. Essentially a custody battle between Ashley and their current foster parent, who we also are not naming because she is a protected party by the Minnesota courts. The foster parent got placement of the kids on Christmas Eve in 2021 and wants to adopt them. So that's kind of been the challenge for Ashley. It has not been easy for her, despite having kind of outstanding qualifications on paper. In addition to being a child welfare social worker, she is a licensed foster parent. She has fostered high needs children before, but because the children have stayed with this foster parent for a bit of time now, there's a bit of pressure from those in charge of the case for them to not have another disrupted placement.
So that is really core to the dispute that has emerged here. These workers in the county in Minnesota where the children are living with right now with the foster parent who wants to adopt feel that the length of time spent with this foster parent is such that they've created a bond that they cannot jeopardize now. That is their view, that this attachment to the foster parent supersedes the fact that Ashley is a impeccably, I would say, credentialed person to care for a child, both professionally and as a relative of the family.
Right. And, on the other hand, Ashley, her family, and those supporting her, which include the local chapter of the NAACP, they're all kind of bringing up, well, yes, there is this short-term attachment with the foster parent that, of course, would be challenging for the children, but there's a long-term risk of harm for kids who are permanently severed from their biological family. So that's a key point that they're fighting, right? That, there's research that suggests that kids ultimately fare better when they stay connected to their extended family.
Right. Which is this kind of stated priority in Minnesota, and I think that's something that you guys kind of surfaced in your reporting here is that, Minnesota in general has come to increasingly rely on kin, even in this county. I mean, it's not even like this county is kind of like above average, right?
It is. Yeah. The county is above average compared to Minnesota, which, yeah, John, like you said, has been getting higher and higher numbers of kids living with relatives. It is worth noting that Ojai County is really small. So the raw numbers of kids that we're talking about in foster care are around 200. The vast majority of those kids are white. So all of those things are going to play, I think, into their ability to place with kin or reliance on kin.
Yeah. Okay, so like I said at the top, you got to go and read the story. There are lots of twists and turns. There's lots of detail. These guys did an excellent job reporting it out and giving context. But this sort of still hangs in the balance. So can you talk a little bit just about sort of where what's the lay of the land right now in court? Is Ashley done for in terms of her candidacy here, or is there still an opening? Try to walk people through sort of what's left for the courts to hash out, because right now these kids live with the foster parent.
Right. Without giving away too much. Yeah. Right now the kids are still with the foster parent. The case is being brought before the Minnesota Court of Appeals. So Ashley is not giving up. They're also still trying to push for the possibility of the children's maternal grandmother being an adoption option if they exhaust all avenues with Ashley and aren't able to make that adoption work. So they're still fighting in the appeals court now, and we will see.
We definitely will see, and we'll keep people, apprised on the kind of serious page on the imprint if things do happen in this case. I would just say personally, this is now the second story we've done in Minnesota with just very eerily similar circumstances. You have a relative, a close relative, who's perfectly qualified to come in and take a child who needs a permanent place to live. I guess I'll link folks back to that as well. It's called Latonia versus Chisago County. We very, very effectively put it out like 2 months before the pandemic broke out. So I don't think a lot of people read it at the time, but I just remember, reading the early drafts of what you guys were putting together here and being like, wow, this is insane. And I think the common thread practice wise, because when you read the two stories, you'll see there's other connections, but it's the fact that these cases go on for a long time. And then that time starts to work against relatives, like that was what really jumped out, especially in your guys' story, is just, man, the attachment issue, which becomes very front and center in the case, was kind of manufactured by the case.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Crazy. So we'll keep folks posted on that. Sarah Tiano, go read her story. Thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John.
All right, when we come back, some more headlines in child welfare and youth justice.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over. My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
Okay, let's look at some more recent news in child welfare and youth justice, and we will start with some interesting research on income supports and relationships for older youth in foster care. The first study we're going to talk about was co-written by Lindsay Bullinger, former guest of this podcast. She came on, it must have been years ago now, to talk about her work on kind of the role of money, the impact of money on child maltreatment cases, in particular on reporting of maltreatment. We talked at that point about minimum wage connections, I think, and then a few other things kind of as we were just getting started with the pandemic. In this study, Bollinger and her two co-authors tried to test whether a more universal cash transfers could improve both minor and severe outcomes of child well-being and help to further improve children's lives. And to do that, what they did was sort of use the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend, which is an annual individual payment. I think it's usually around $1,600 to each resident of Alaska, and that is regardless of immigration status or income or wealth. There's room to study the effects of that dividend because you can kind of compare babies to some extent born in one part of the year or another, because when you are born kind of dictates when you'd be eligible for the payment. You can read the study for a much better explanation of all that than I just gave you. And I will link to the study along with all the other ones I'm going to chat about here in the show notes. But the main finding on this one was that the authors here estimate that transferring an additional $1,000 to families in the early months of a child's life reduced the likelihood that a child's referred to children's services by 2 percentage points. So that's sort of big picture referrals to children's services. It declines by that $1,000 corresponds to 2 percentage points less, a lower referral rate. $1,000 also corresponds to reduced referrals for child neglect and physical abuse by age 3 by 10 and 30%. So that's by age 3, a reduction of 10% for child neglect, 30% for physical abuse referrals. And then when they looked at the likelihood of a child death by age 5, they connect that additional $1,000 to a reduction of about 30%. That's how they phrased it. Now, on a less sunny note for the strategy of unconditional cash, a randomized control trial of 1,000 mother-child combos found that a $4,000 annual cash infusion given to the moms for the first several years of a child's life did not have an impact on child health or sleep. Those were the two kind of pre-selected focal points for the early findings of the trial. The full summary from the study I'm quoting here: in this study, unconditional cash transfers to mothers experiencing poverty did not improve reports of their child's health, sleep, or healthcare utilization. However, stable income support of this magnitude did improve toddlers' consumption of fresh produce. Also cited here in the findings, I'm just going to quote again, the cash gifts did not improve maternal stress, mental health symptoms, or relationship quality, which are all closely associated with the quality of children's sleep and bedtime interactions. And the cash gifts also had no effect on reported food insecurity, housing quality, or the likelihood of purchasing a crib. So the study phase of that trial is over, right? The period of time in which the unconditional cash is given out, but tracking is continuing on this. So there is certainly a chance that the longer tail effects of that cash starts to show itself, in an impact on child health over time. And there are more planned, research markers that the authors and are planning to look at, and those include child behavior. So I do suspect that we'll get a full picture along the way, but the early results of that did not support, a very strong connection between this unconditional cash and child well-being, which, to be fair, that is an upstream look at the impact of unconditional cash. It's certainly an important one. There is obviously a difference between what cash could do to reduce the involvement of CPS and actual child well-being. And I think that that's something that's going to be interesting as we get more and more studies of things like the, advanced child tax credit that was part of the pandemic support, or an income tax credit, more studies of, unconditional cash given in other studies like this one that we're just talking about now. Okay, and then the other study I wanted to talk about comes out of the University of Connecticut, home to so many basketball championships. I can't help but say it. I'm a fan. Where researchers took a pretty creative approach in looking at enduring relationships for older foster youth. So here's what they did. There's a study that we've talked about quite a few times on this podcast called the Cal Youth Study. You might have heard of the Midwest Study. These are probably the two most robust examinations of, life after foster care for youth who age out without any sort of connection to like formal permanency, adoption or reunification or guardianships. The Midwest evaluation was first. It really informed a lot of the policy around extending foster care. The Cal Youth Study is much more recent. And what it did was it followed youth out of extended foster care or youth who chose not to participate in it and tracked them along the line from, I think 17 all the way to age 26, if I am not mistaken, to gauge what different aspects of their life were: educational achievement, any trouble with the law, experiencing homelessness, earned income and full-time employment, things like that. The study authors here at UConn did was go drill down into the Cal Youth Study participants and sort of separate them into two groups. The one group, which is the one they wanted to look at, are young people who at age 17 and then on the other end of the Cal Youth Study, so in a prolonged period of time, identified the same adult as kind of having a meaningful relationship or being a permanent adult, presence in their life. And they would call that an enduring relationship. And so they went into the Cal Youth participation survey to sort of parse between that group and a group that did not identify the same person as having, an enduring relationship with them. And I'm just going to read to you kind of the two pretty significant things that they found here. First, enduring relationships had real consequences for foster youth, reducing the risk of negative outcomes in early adulthood, such as food insecurity, economic hardship, and homelessness. They were also more likely to experience positive outcomes, such as having greater earnings, finishing some college. Surprisingly, the number of individuals the youth said they had in their network was not a key factor. So now this is me, not the direct quote, but it didn't matter if it was, I have 10 enduring relationships. As long as you had one, those good outcomes or superior outcomes, I guess, were possible. And then so that sets up, establishing that for the youth who identified an enduring relationship, that mattered. So that would be the good news. The bad news is that the majority of participants in the Cal Youth Survey did not have an enduring relationship. Slightly less than half, 48%, of the youth studied had an enduring relationship at a point in their lives, and I'm quoting now again from the study, when the safety net of the Child Welfare Agency was no longer available to them. Most youth had only one enduring relationship, commonly with a biological family member or someone they described as family. That means about half did not have such a relationship, end quote. So to just kind of bring this all together, what they identified was, the outcomes markers in the Cal Youth Survey indicate that the youth who identified an enduring relationship experienced better outcomes. Less than half identified an enduring relationship. And of the ones who did, most only had one enduring relationship. And it was most commonly with a biological family member. So I think the thing that should really raise the eye of child welfare systems in particular here is that even in the situations where there was the presence of an enduring relationship, it was probably not the foster care system or the caseworkers who were forging that enduring relationship with a biological family member at that age. Could be, and in some cases probably did. But I think that what that really kind of jumped out to me and said is, even of the group who identified an enduring relationship, they probably secured that enduring relationship on their own. They were not supported by anybody in the system, or they were not kind of systemically supported to identify other, potential adults that could be in their life in a more permanent way as they aged out into adulthood. So again, I will link to all that stuff. So on the youth justice front, I would not call this research, so I'm not going to lump it into the study section of this headlines. But I did think this is kind of an interesting look at how public opinion can be shaped by problematic numbers. So an October 2023 poll from Gonzales Research gauged public opinion on President Biden and Maryland's Governor Wes Moore. Obviously, this was done for Marylanders. And it tacked on some questions about youth and crime as well. And those questions, I confirmed, were written by the pollster. His name's Patrick Gonzales, not by a lobbying group or any sort of faction that was interested in youth crime. Mr. Gonzales told me that this is just a topic that was hot in the Maryland and DC area, and so he wanted to put some questions in the field to get impact. So, working backwards here, the findings of the poll showed that 62% of white Democrats favor laws that are lenient to better help the kids, while 62% of Black Democrats want laws that are strict, which hold the individuals responsible and accountable for their behavior. It's a result that one might understandably raise an eye at or be surprised and read on, and for that reason, it did get picked up in quite a bit of local media. So I said working backwards. Those were the findings. Here's the question that yielded those findings. And I'm going to read the entirety of the question as it was asked to respondents. What type of laws, in your opinion, ultimately better help our children under 18 who commit crimes? And here are the two choices. 1, laws that are strict, which include things such as juvenile detention and boot camps. This holds individuals responsible and accountable for their behavior. Or laws that are lenient, which include things such as social programs and counseling. This recognizes that society is responsible for much of this behavior. So I think why this is significant is that when you look at the actual options that people were provided here, they really reflect a possibility in either direction that just does not what the reality is on the ground. There is no such thing as a system that only includes juvenile detention and boot camps, which was in the first session. I don't think there's been a boot camp in Maryland, and I don't know how long. Boot camps have been all but extricated from the continuum in juvenile justice. So that was a poor choice, to be honest, of terminology. But there's no juvenile system that includes only detention and boot camps or anything like it. There's no system that only includes social programs and counseling currently. I realize that there are probably people who feel that there should be systems that only include one or the other, but it's just not the reality on the ground. So you're forced in this situation to choose between two options that really don't exist, with language that really kind of pushes you in one direction or the other. So you're given this option of social programs and counseling and then told that this recognizes society is responsible for much of this behavior. Well, what if you support those concepts being a very large part of your juvenile justice system, but you don't agree that society is responsible for much of youth behavior? That's entirely possible to hold those two thoughts at the same time. To draw a local analogy in Maryland for this, it would be like putting that to Marylanders as choose between juvenile detention and boot camp or programs and community alternatives, or whatever the phrasing was. It's sort of like asking, box one, do you think that the Baltimore Ravens should score more points by doing things like playing offense? Or do you think that the Baltimore Ravens should improve on defense by allowing less points on defense? It's sort of like most people would tell you, if you were just having a conversation, I think they should both try to score more points and stop the other team from scoring more points. This is a half-baked analogy, admittedly, but there's just no world on a football team where you wouldn't have to address playing offense and defense. In every juvenile justice continuum around this country right now, there is an array of options that includes community ones, social programs, detention centers, and incarceration. And so putting them in two boxes and forcing people to pick is just kind of a flawed premise. So anyway, I'll include the poll because it actually included another problematic question. The other question, and this didn't get as much ink, but they asked, currently in Maryland, juveniles between the ages of 14 and 17 who commit murder or rape can be charged as adults. Would you support or oppose changing this law so that they cannot be charged as adults, but have these cases heard in juvenile court? Well, actually, in Maryland right now, juveniles between the age of 14 and 17 who commit murder or rape must be charged as adults. And not can, they must be. And the only real legislative policies that have been bandied about are ones that would change it from must to can. So this is kind of this is asking a question about a law that doesn't exist yet and changing it to a law nobody has asked for. And anyway, this got ink. It was a survey that was put out. I'm sure that Patrick Gonzales is an experienced political pollster and just a pollster overall. But, in this case, these were questions that have some fairly flawed premises in it, in my opinion, that then went on to kind of shape some of the media landscape around youth justice and the role of youth in the bigger context of something that people are, rightfully worrying about right now, which is certainly in the DC area, an uptick in overall violent crime, in particular in homicides there. To draw a local analogy in Maryland for this, it would be like putting that to Marylanders as choose between juvenile detention and boot camp or programs and community alternatives, or whatever the phrasing was. It's sort of like asking, box one, do you think that the Baltimore Ravens should score more points by doing things like playing offense? Or do you think that the Baltimore Ravens should improve on defense by allowing less points on defense? It's sort of like most people would tell you if you were just having a conversation, I think they should both try to score more points and stop the other team from scoring more points. This is a half-baked analogy, admittedly, but, there's just no world on a football team where you wouldn't have to address playing offense and defense. In every juvenile justice continuum around this country right now, there is an array of options that includes community ones, social programs, detention centers, and incarceration. And so putting them in two boxes and forcing people to pick is just kind of a flawed premise. During the Trump administration, South Carolina sort of became the epicenter of the debate over the role of faith-based providers in child welfare, namely around the issue of whether they must be allowed to follow their own religious ideology in deciding who to work with and serve. The Trump administration gave a waiver to one large faith-based provider in the states called Miracle Hill to operate with federal funding in that space, despite the fact that they were, in fact, following religious ideology and in that way discriminating against, same-sex couples or people who were not, identical to their Christian denomination. And that all came to, the waiver was, to get around Obama-era rules that required non-discrimination for the receipt of federal funds in that space. And there were also two court challenges raised against Miracle Hill over this issue right around that time. One of them led by a single mom who actually didn't want to foster or adopt through Miracle Hill. She just wanted to volunteer with foster youth for them. She was turned away because she did not, quote, share Miracle Hill's evangelical Christian beliefs and couldn't affirm its statement of faith. Another of the lawsuits was led by a same-sex couple seeking to foster that ran into the same barriers with Miracle Hill. Those cases are called Rogers v. Health and Human Services and Madonna v. Health and Human Services. So the decisions are out in both of those cases. It was handled sort of jointly by U.S. District Judge Joseph Dawson III, and in both cases, Miracle Hill has prevailed. Now, there's two interesting things about the ruling here that I think kind of transcend just this one decision, and I think are kind of interesting as more and more challenges I would expect around the role of faith-based organizations and their right to discriminate continue in different places. So here is one of the, this is from one of the rulings by Dawson, and I'm quoting here: plaintiffs could get the same services at 26 other private agencies in the state, including 18 in the upstate or with the state itself. which I think is very significant because that is going to be a very tough cliff if justices around the country and other places and other district courts hold to that same logic. It will be very difficult for anybody to really challenge, state laws that hold faith-based providers harmless from discrimination agreements and things like that. Because if you point to the fact that there are any number of providers who do not, insist on you being a straight couple or following exactly, a certain Christian denomination, if you can just point to, see, there are other options where you could go for service, that's kind of hard to get around, because I'm sure in the vast majority of states, if not all states, there are in fact more than one provider. And I know Texas, which has a faith-based discrimination law that enables faith-based providers there to kind of follow ideology, they had put in this kind of requirement that there are, in different catchment areas of the state, there had to be a certain number of providers who would take anybody, who would work with anybody and not discriminate. So that, I think, that Judge Dawson called that out directly was kind of interesting. The other part is the way that a Supreme Court case recently decided in a 9-0 decision that included all of the liberal justices, Fulton v. City of Philadelphia. How that case was referred to here, I thought was pretty significant. Because in both of these decisions, Judge Dawson said that the 9-0 vote in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia foreclosed, that was his word, foreclosed the arguments of the plaintiffs in these cases. And, I covered the Fulton v. City of Philadelphia case as it kind of moved through to the Supreme Court, and then we covered the decision at the imprint. The reason that decision was 9-0 was because it ended up not being this very large referendum that it could have been on, completely around religious freedom of expression, or whatever term you want to use, the right to discriminate, license to discriminate. Instead, the decision was extremely narrowly tailored. I'm working off of memory here, but around the fact that City of Philadelphia, did have a non-discrimination clause in place, but also empowered their child welfare director to provide waivers to that, and then did not choose to do so for a faith-based provider. So the decision was really around that. So it is really, quite something that here's a U.S. district judge basically saying this decision foreclosed any argument seeking anything around discrimination, even though, I did not see anything about the issuance of a waiver from a non-discrimination agreement in South Carolina that related to this. And I think this kind of typifies the shift here. I pulled back from our story at the end of the Fulton decision. We had quoted Rachel Laser, who is with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She issued a press release after the Fulton decision that described it as a narrow decision that turned, I'm going to quote her here, turned on the specific facts of the case, meaning that, quote, religious extremists did not get this sweeping free pass they were seeking to discriminate wherever and however they want. Fast forward to this decision, and here is what Rachel Laser had to say about Judge Dawson's decision in these two cases. Foster care agencies working on behalf of the government should not be allowed to discriminate against prospective foster parents because they don't live according to one narrow set of conservative religious beliefs. Religious freedom can never be a license to discriminate. And she told that to the Christian Broadcast Network for their story, who, paraphrased that she also was frustrated with the argument that the Supreme Court's 2021 decision in Fulton had confused the nation's lower courts. So I think that kind of sets up the difference here, right? This was thought at the time to have been a very narrowly tailored case. And at least at the district court level, we are now seeing an example of somebody saying that case really shut the door on a lot of arguments against, requiring faith-based providers not to discriminate. And it'll be interesting. I would guess that at least one, if not both of these, will be appealed. So we might be right back in circuit court and Supreme Court with this issue in short order. All right, I'll wrap up for the week here with some other recommendations from our work here at the Imprint, in addition to Sarah Tiano's Fighting for Kin series that we already talked about. Please go read it. Story number 1 out of New York. At a recent public hearing that ended up going for 8 hours, state lawmakers heard from advocates, practitioners, and the head of New York City's child welfare agency, Jess Danhauser, on the issue of mandated reporting. And one very juicy thing happened at this hearing. I'm sure more than that, but in particular, Andrew Hevesy, who is a state assembly member who presided over this hearing, queried whether the state could eliminate mandated reporting without incurring any problem other than, the potential loss of about $4 million in federal funding. I'm just going to quote from our story. This is Hevesy asking Jess Danhauser questions during the hearing. Is this something that we can eliminate? Hevesy asked Danhauser, referring to New York's compliance with the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which incentivizes states to create mandated reporting systems. Hevesy said, forego that small amount of money from the federal government and still do the best we can to protect our kids. Is that a possibility? Danhauser didn't disagree. We have to fundamentally reorient our system to be about a much narrower set of young people who are really in danger. So this is a definite watch this space, because I think it just gets to one truth about federal law and policy that I think probably gets, even we do probably not a good enough job of, we'll say, and a lot of media that write about, when they actually do cover federal child welfare policy, which is not a lot, will say, federal law requires X, Y, or Z. In reality, most things that people do in connection with federal policy are in exchange for money. There are constitutional things they need to do, of course, but the reason that mandated reporting is kind of viewed as a federal policy that you have to comply with, as is described in that story, is that there is a certain amount of money tied into the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that you would not get if you did not operate all the different, pieces of CAPTA compliance. CAPTA is the acronym for that law. One of which is to have a mandated reporting system. Let's look at another one. In the case of Title 4E, which is a multi-billion-dollar entitlement that states have come to very much rely on to pay for things like foster care and adoption for a lot of kids, there's a lot of money at stake, so there's a lot of incentive to comply. With CAPTA, the amount of money that's connected to things like having a mandated reporting system are very small. So even in a very large state like New York, Hevesy is saying here that, his information is that they'd lose about $4 million in funding, which really at that point makes the financial reason a rounding error, which then frees them up to really have the conversation. So should we do this or not? And I think that that's where, we're going to maybe see it in this legislative session, whether New York is going to be kind of a canary in the coal mine on mandated reporting. There's a lot of very sharp disagreements about the future of child welfare. I have seen folks on lots of different sides of that discussion cast a pretty dubious eye of late on mandated reporting. Of course, people who are, supportive of abolishing or coming close to that in child welfare oppose it and want to repeal CAPTA. I have seen people who they vehemently disagree with, pretty much openly support an end to or a rollback, at the very least, of mandated reporting. I've also, in New York, Eric Brettschneider, who's, Jess Danhauser is the head of ACS. Eric Brettschneider was sort of the second in command at the Child Welfare Agency in New York for a very long time. He's since retired to academia, but he was one of the first panelists who spoke to a U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that looked into race and racial disparities and racism within the New York child welfare system. And in his opening remarks to that system, this is a long time insider system practitioner who said one of the things he would recommend right off the bat is to get rid of mandated reporting. All right, story 2. In what is probably the most comprehensive study of sexual and reproductive health outcomes in education for youth and foster care, a study in California found that young people in the nation's largest foster care system are being better served when it comes to sexual and reproductive health care but that there are still some shortcomings. Just a few pullouts from this. You should go read the story. It's quick and really does a good job summarizing, exactly how groundbreaking it is to actually look at this stuff. We had Michael Fitzgerald, our reporter, on, several months ago to talk about his series High Stakes Silent Systems, which is really about the complete absence of attention that sexual and reproductive health get within the kind of child welfare space. But here's a few pullouts from this look at California system. First, foster youth between the ages of 10 and 20 are seen for Medicaid guaranteed well care visits at a far higher clip than the overall Medicaid group at 63% of foster youth compared with 47% overall of Medicaid youth. But that flips when it comes to actually getting services once somebody is pregnant. Just 55% of pregnant foster youth received prenatal care visits during their first trimester. That compares to 64% among their peers. And then while the new report shows foster youth were only slightly more likely to deliver a low birth weight baby, foster youth identified as Black saw the highest rates. 12% of their babies were small compared to 7% of babies born to other youth in Medi-Cal, which is the California Medicaid program. So take a look at the story. It's pretty interesting, and it's a link to the full study too, if you really want to geek out within the story. Last one here, I wanted to just commend Nell Bernstein's really beautiful look at the life's work of David Innocencio, founder of The Beat Within, which is just a real pioneering venture in engaging system-impacted youth in writing and journalism. So just as a teaser, I'm going to read you the opening of this story, but I really recommend reading it. David and what he built with The Beat Within is an important marker in what we do, which is, the intersection of youth justice in this case and journalism. So here's the intro. For nearly 3 decades, young people in juvenile halls around the San Francisco Bay Area have waited anxiously for David Innocencio to show up on their units with copies of The Beat Within. They're eager to see their bylines printed in 7.5 font to fit as much text as possible into the magazine's 72 pages and to read each other's writing. A typical edition of the twice-monthly publication, written and illustrated by incarcerated youth, brims with ambition, grief, hope, remorse, and longing for life outside jail walls. So I'll link everybody to that story. And rest in peace to David Innocencio. He truly made a huge impact. He was years ahead on this idea. All right, that is what we got for this week. Thanks to the imprint's Sarah Tiano for joining me to talk about her story, Fighting for Kin. Go check it out. And also thanks to Accenture for sponsoring this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can also email us at any time at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.